Good morning and welcome. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Ms. Scoon, for joining us this morning, and also, of course, President Williams for welcoming us to your campus and such a warm welcome this morning. I also want to welcome you to the Florida Civic Advance. As Bob said, my name is Terri Susan Fine, and I teach political science in the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs. And I'm also fortunate for the last 10 years to serve as the Associate Director of the Lou Frey Institute of Politics and Government. So 2019 is a very exciting year for civics and civic education. The governor, as Bob said, just announced his intention to bring a high school civics exam modeled on the U.S. naturalization exam, while in 2018, Floridians voted to support Amendment 4, which would grant full voting privileges to former felons. Both issues, however, are subject to our checks and balances system, as these initiatives have been battled in the state legislatures and in the courts. We are less than 2 months away from the first primaries and caucuses that will result in the nomination and later presidential election. Regardless of our political party or ideology, our race, sex, age, or religion, we are all better off the more we know about our civic life in our country, our state, and our communities. Today, I am pleased to introduce our voter education and civic service keynote address presented by Ms. Cecile Scoon, Esquire. She serves as first vice president of the Florida League of Women Voters and is past president of the League of Women Voters of Bay County. Ms. Scoon is a naturalized U.S. citizen, and she serves as the chair of the State League efforts on voting rights restoration and is a proud member of the Chi Omicron Omega chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. She is the proud mother of 3 adult children and practices law with her husband, Alvin Peters. Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to introduce Ms. Cecile Scoon.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great honor to be here. I've been looking at many of the attendees and the other speakers, and I see some friends from home in the audience, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from everybody else. But I'm going to take a few minutes and share with you some thoughts that I've put together on civic engagement and what does it mean to me and what does it mean to all of us. It's a really, really important and powerful time for us. Next year, I think it's on a lot of people's minds, it's the centennial of women's right to vote, August 1920, and it'll be 100 years. And so it's really, I think, appropriate for us to look back and say, what's been done at this very, very powerful time. It's also really important, I think, to, let's see. I did it. It's also really important for us to think about our founding constitutional documents. I am a practicing civil rights attorney, and so I practice in the Title VII plaintiff's side, which is the 7 protected classes: age, nationality, race, religion, gender, disability. And so I've had a lot of very interesting conversations, depositions, and situations that are sad many times that I'm still needed. But when you think about the way our nation started, and just you actually look at our Constitution, it enshrined, as we all know, basically discrimination, of very significant discrimination, of course, fighting for liberty against the oppression of the king, they did set up, governmental checks and balances and some really wonderful things that have evolved, but that was one of the compromises. And so when you look at that document, and when it basically made women children for the rest of their lives and unable to lead their lives and unable to control their own wealth and make a lot of decisions, when you look at that document and you think about what that means, and when you think about what it meant for persons of African descent to be 3/5 of a person, basically a thing. So women were children forever, and people of color were things. And when you realize that that stayed in place for hundreds of years, and what the import of that is, and when you layer on top of it the state legislation that followed it, and just customary practice, when you have your founding documents that say things like that, then I say to myself, I shouldn't be surprised that my practice is booming. I wish it would literally, close down, honestly. But because when you start that way, it's got a long, long tail. Even though we acknowledge intellectually these things shouldn't be, we should get past it. When things are that deeply embedded, it's really in the core, in our governmental entity, it's really hard to root it out. It's really hard to see it. So I see that oftentimes in my cases, and I'll have somebody who'll say the most outrageous things and not even realize that they may be being very sexist or racist or ableist, or I've heard people say about, for example, this is a common fact scenario. A woman banker, she might be a head teller, been in a bank business for 20 years, does a great job, and she's in her 40s, right? And they'll hire a young man, 22, 23, maybe 25, doesn't know anything about banking. And he goes into the training, and she's a trainer. And so she'll train this young man, and he'll be making mistakes, and there'll be an opening, right? And she'll be the acting manager of that bank. But because she knows people and she knows relationships, the numbers just shoot up. Then when she gets the bank going really well, they don't even really often announce the openings, but if they do, they'll pick the young man. And when you ask if the lawsuit is filed, which in a fact situation like that, a lawsuit could be filed, right? The managers who did the decision making, they'll say, I just didn't see Mrs. Jones in that light. And she's got the numbers, she's got the time, she's doing the job. I've heard those words so many times from so many different mouths. I just didn't see so-and-so in that light. And in those kind of statements, when they're ignoring the fact that the person is actually producing, that kind of lets you know, it goes back to our Constitution, how those deeply held attitudes basically just edit the picture. And so I thought it would be, helpful to kind of look at the journey again of the two groups that were specifically held down and disenfranchised, starting from the very, very beginning. And I thought it would be interesting to take a little history journey to see what's happened in that time frame. I'm really fascinated by the first suffragettes. And I had the honor of going up to Seneca Falls and leading some tours for the League of Women Voters, and I do my research. Seneca Falls, New York, where they had their first convention of sentiments. But before that, what started it, much of the combustion for women's rights in that quadrant of many of the Quaker women, they were really passionate about abolishing slavery. They were moved to tears. Their homes were often at the end of the Underground Railroad, so they would actually be taking in persons who'd been enslaved and would be dressing their wounds, the dog bites, or whatever injuries they'd had, helping them live through life, feeding them. And they would see, literally, the crisscross of the scarring on their backs, the terrible stories of children being sold away, rapes, just the whole sordid and very upsetting thing. And because the Quakers had the value that there is nothing between a person and God, it was literally blasphemy. Not just immoral and that's inhuman, but literally blasphemy to their sense of religion, that someone would insert themselves and be the master of another person. That just was like outrageous to them. So they found their hearts filling, they found their passion going, and they would hear the stories of the enslaved. And they said, you know, we got to get out there and we got to talk about this. We got to let other people know how bad this is. We got to get on the road. We're feeding these people. We know their wounds. We know their pain. People don't realize how bad it really is. We can help. And so they started trying to get out and have little community events outside of their kitchens and their homes. And lo and behold, some of the men said, what do you think you're doing? You need to get back and tend to the kids, and they're going to hurt your mind, and you know, your female organs can't take. I mean, they heard everything of why this shouldn't go. And so the story there, the message there is that, the powerful message there is that by caring about others and about seeing others' humanity and understanding their pain and their struggle and being so passionate about it, they got out of their silo. They got out of their comfort zone. They wanted to try something new. They wanted to break through that barrier. And they bounced up against their own barrier. It kind of reflected the light back on themselves and their own limitations across their lives. And they realized, hey, we're not going to get this issue fixed. We're not going to get any political issue fixed until we enable ourselves to have the vote. So it came from a very personal double entendre, so to speak, because they were trying to do something on abolition, and then they realized that their mouths were shut across the board. Several of them, and some of their names are very well known. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a great writer. Her father was a lawyer, and he always said he wished that he'd had a son. He did have a son, but he wanted, you know, she was like brilliant, and he would allow her to read the books, and he would, you know, say, gosh, if only she were a man. She married and had many, many children, and believed in them being liberated and free. So people would write about her rambunctious children running around the house, but she didn't want to hold them down, you know, but that was her idea of freedom. Lucretia Mott, again, in the anti-slavery, women's rights. Many of these ladies had very powerful positions in the abolitionist movement, and they worked with people like Frederick Douglass. That just blew my mind. I don't know if a lot of you knew that, but I never learned that so much of that impetus came from the moral authority of trying to do something against one of the biggest scourges of our nation. There's another woman, Martha Coffin Wright. They were sisters. She actually was a part of the Underground Railroad. I mean, the things that they saw, I'm sure also what happens when you see the plight of others, it kind of gives, you know, that relative feeling, like, relatively speaking, my situation is not that bad. Relatively speaking, I am not risking as much for me to speak up and get involved. And I often say that to myself when I practice in my law practice. I've had occasion sometimes to sue the government. And I remember I sued the city where I live, and I had sued the city of Pensacola, but it was more about firefighters. It was a little more scary suing in my town, which is Bay County, Panama City, generally very friendly, but very, very conservative, as I think everybody knows. And it turned out it was a big deal in the newspaper. And several of the firefighters some of them had said, you know, to each other in the firehouse, they'd said, you know, I sure hope I don't have to rescue a black person because I'm not going to resuscitate that end, you know. They would just allow, somebody else would have to be there to save the life because they weren't going to go mouth to mouth with anybody, if you know, like that. That was just unheard of. And I had cases literally where black firemen, when they first joined the firehouses, because throughout the South and actually throughout much of the country, that was like one of the last bastions of white male bonding. Because they're hunters, fishermen, they're out in the firehouse, they're drinking, having a good time, doing their weights and lifting and just like cooking for themselves, no women around. That was another issue, women trying to break through. But they took it really hard when they had to let African-American men join. And they did many things to them that was extremely humiliating. Picking up butts, had to be outside, couldn't come in the air conditioning. I mean, these are facts. These are things that white men testified to, that was going on. And sometimes when I brought the case in Panama City, some of them had been known to make threats against others. And it was a big thing in the newspaper, and they gave us police protection. They gave us police protection at my office. And I thought, woo, and I just prayed about it, and I said to myself, back to that relative, I did not have to escape hound dogs and be bitten and beaten. There's no crisscross marks on my back, not physically anyway. I got some, but not that you can see. I've raised all my children. I've had so many opportunities. I've had the benefit of every civil rights action in this nation because I'm a twofer. I'm black and I'm female. And yeah, I've got skills, but the doors wouldn't have been open to me but for the efforts of many, many, many others. And I'm very, very grateful to them. And when I get those little situations where I go, I wonder how this is going to work, and I hope that nothing negative, nothing physical comes of my bringing the suit, whatever reason it is. It could be sexual harassment, whatever kind of case. I hope everyone's going to stay calm. I just think about what people had to endure before me, and it makes everything more relative. And I feel that in some sense that the women who were fighting for women's rights, because they started with such abject horror and decimation of humanity, because they had that vision in mind, it maybe made their lives easier and made them more ready to step forward and take those chances. This is actually a statue. It's a multi-person statue in Seneca Falls. And you see amongst them, there's Frederick Douglass, and they were made to be life-size. And there are just so many people there. And the stories, I mean, you just read and you're like, wow, they were so far ahead of their time. And that's encouraging too, because sometimes we have our visions, and sometimes in the moment, people may think, hey, that's a little bit out there. But if you know in your heart where your journey is leading to, you can take, sustenance to know that, hold on. I mean, Susan B. Anthony, she was willing to vote. They wanted to jail her, but she wouldn't pay the fine, and the judge dismissed it. I mean, you have to know what you're willing to do for your views and your beliefs. But I was amazed to learn that they actually not only did political work together, they socialized. They had tea parties. And many of the Quaker families invited the African-American families to stay with them. So you could go into the Susan B. Anthony's house, and there'd be a little plaque, and it would say, this family stayed here. And I'm thinking, what? Back in the day? I mean, they were living their values. It wasn't just vote for me, or I've got the way for you to survive. They were literally connecting, and they were literally, stepping outside the boundaries in their social world, and that was very, very powerful for me. And Frederick Douglass, who had such a wonderful pen and such a wonderful voice that reached so many people through the nation, supported women's rights. He was right there, the very first meeting, and advocated for them and said, yes, this is part of our journey. This is where we have to come from our constitutional foundation. We have to take this path together. So he was one of the men that was there. And there were other men, many of them husbands, and many of them Quaker, to give that particular religious sect their due because of their values and their sense of everybody's innate value before God. they gave them the power to influence and step outside of their comfort zones. Looking back 100 years at the centennial, a lot of people don't realize, I'm glad they're getting the civic lessons in school, but a lot of people don't realize that there were trials, people were beaten, they were arrested, lost community acceptance, they were mocked, and sometimes their marriages were threatened. But they won, finally. And what happened when they won? When they won, they realized that the problems that they're facing are some of the same problems that we're facing today with Amendment 4. They realized we're dealing with a whole group of people that by law, by government edict, had not been allowed to participate in any way, shape, or form in having a voice in their government and their community. We're right there, people. We are right there with Amendment 4. The women realized that they had to do education. They had to encourage people away from their fear. Because, yeah, we got the law passed, but, didn't you lose your job and your husband beat you or whatever negative thing? They were very afraid to step forward and to actually use the franchise. So the League of Women Voters, they're actually precursors, started because of that issue. Yes, they were fighting for rights, but they realized that they had to educate. They had to make it comfortable. They had to welcome people. They had to make it relevant. This is going to impact your life. You want to have control over your children? Your father left you this legacy, but you married Mr. Smith, and he's going to control all that. You want to do something about that law? They had to bring it down to where the women could understand the impact on their lives and their children's lives. And that's when women started, by and large, participating. But there was that whole gap, because those gaps occur when people have been frozen out. And it's something that we have to remember. Just because we in this room, myself included, are super excited about civic engagement, we understand many of the consequences of not being involved. You got to remember, you're almost like singing a song to someone who's had things in their ear and they can't hear you because their ears have been stopped up, not necessarily because they wanted it that way. It was imposed upon them. And I look at our struggle with Amendment 4 in much the same way. And interestingly, as we're coming up on our 400th anniversary of the first persons being enslaved in this nation, coming up on that too. When you look at, again, the two groups that were intentionally written into our framework as being less than, and you watch the journey that they've had, it's a very powerful message. Because Amendment 4, not only do we have that outreach and that effort that we have to welcome returning citizens, find returning citizens, inform them. Because a lot of them, why read the paper if you can't participate? Why watch the news? That's not a part of your world. It's been shunned to you. And the realities of it are, many of them are struggling so hard because they were born into difficult situations, and certainly having that felony conviction on their record where they can only live certain places, can't get certain licenses. There's so many ramifications of those often early decisions in their lives that they're really not thinking about this esoteric stuff about voting. Then you layer into that something that I've struggled really, really, really hard to understand. And a little bit is that my background. Was born American, but my father was from another country, from Grenada. And he spoke like this. He had like the Uncola man, for those of us old enough to remember Uncola. And he was a great big bear and just very, very loving. And he was a lawyer. And he would say, Cecile, this country is a wonderful country. It's very imperfect, but we have more opportunity. Education is the way. He would always tell us, believe and work to make this country live up to its promises. Get in there in the trenches. Don't sit around and complain in the back or get the benefit. That was something he really, really believed in. And I know when I came back to the States, I was 15, I really had a culture shock. Because in the Caribbean, in much of the Caribbean, even to this day, people who are black and brown run those nation states. The governor general is a person of color. The people down the street are people of color. Paler people come, give us their money, and they leave. They're not very consequential in general. So I literally had a flip experience of racial kind of, proportions and who's important and who's not important. So coming back to the States at 15, I was like, whoa, this is a brave new world. Twilight Zone. All these white people are in charge. And I saw, the oppression of black people and the lack of opportunity with a very critical eye, because I wasn't accustomed to seeing it. Not that we didn't have poverty in the Caribbean. We still do. People walk barefoot today, miles. There's a lot of poverty. But the thing that people of color, Caribbean people and African people who I was often associating with, what we say is, when we go home, if someone doesn't like me, I know it's not because of this. That freedom to know you're just yourself. And that's a freedom that white people have all the time. If someone doesn't walk up to you in the store, you never think, oh, I'm white. They wouldn't help me. Doesn't even cross your mind. Oh, that's just a poor service, or they're busy. Everything that happens to a person of color that's not quite perfect, tick-tock, tick-tock, in the back of their mind. Why is this happening? Do I need to challenge it? Do I need to become that angry black lady? Do I need to just be cool or just let it pass? What are my children thinking when they see this? So many things that float through your mind that take up space and make it difficult for us to be our full selves. And I've certainly seen that with many of my cases, that people come in, and again, it's just any oppression based on any reason. And, and it's interesting to me when I have an older white gentleman as a client, and maybe they became disabled, or I've represented people who are Jewish who have been mistreated because of their faith. But when you get the typical older white man who's lived his whole life in a cocoon, a cushion of acceptability and normality, and I'm great, don't even know. They're just breathing great air all the time. And when they experience that mistreatment for no good reason, because, they got a heart condition or whatever, and they've been fine before, those men are literally weeping, brokenhearted. They have no tough skin. They haven't grown up having to defend, having to deflect, having to get along, having to bite their tongue, having to do anything. And I really feel for them because they weren't prepared. And it reminds me of my 15-year-old self when I came to the States. That was me. I was like, whoa. Everything hurt. Everything got under my skin. Everything bothered me. And law school was I was like being in a pincushion, because all the main cases of our nation, all the struggles of our nation are on the backs of black and brown and women. All the big constitutional cases are about people struggling and not making it or making a little bit. Plessy versus Ferguson. The man tried to sue because he'd been living in a free state. He wanted to sue for his freedom and said no. 1857. Dred Scott. That was, I might have misquoted. I'm sorry. Dred Scott was the first one. That was in 1857. And he sued for his family's freedom because they'd lived in a free state for a while, and followed up by Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And when you read those cases and you see the evolution of our nation, it's an amazing thing, but we have so much more to go. To kind of bring it back a little bit to Amendment 4, that the constitutional provision in our state constitution literally stemmed from trying to prevent freed slaves right after emancipation from voting. Then it was men, trying to prevent them from voting. That's what it was all about. And so they said, let's lower the felony level and let's felonize it and say that if they steal anything, we'll make them felons for life and we'll shut their mouth, because they didn't want to share political power. That's where it stemmed from. Well, move forward in time, it impacted everybody. And the Brennan Center did a report, and actually it's 70% white men have been impacted by Amendment 4. So it's not always what you think it is, but that's the way it started. And so, again, when we look at Amendment 4, it's amazing that we got it passed. And thank God we did, right? And what an amazing statement for Florida. It was one of the most popular amendments, and with the promise of re-enfranchising 1.4 million. Well, we know that we're having some issues and some struggles. What it did was it took away the onerous clemency process, which was the only way a person could get their rights to vote before, through the governor. And the prior governor, Governor Scott, he slowed down the process so much that the last person in line who had done the application and waited the 5 or 7 years would have to wait 32 years to be heard, because Governor Scott was only doing less than 300 a year. His total number of people that he re-enfranchised was less than 3,000 in 8 years. And, for example, Charlie Crist did 150,000 in 4 years. We refer to a lot of the people who are going to come back and be able to vote as returning citizens, because, again, they're returning to their citizenship. And it's available to everybody who doesn't have a murder conviction or felony sex offense. Well, moving a little bit here, but a Senate Bill 7066 was enacted because the legislators thought we need some implementing legislation. And unfortunately, the implementing legislation put some strictures on Amendment 4, and we're presently in litigation in state and federal court trying to define what those limits are. But 7066, in addition to saying you've got to pay all your fines and fees, it provided something new that has never existed. And many legal scholars are still scratching their head about that. And they're saying that you can go back to court and modify your criminal sentence. That's like unheard of. If you don't appeal, you're out. That's the way it's been for hundreds of years. So this is like, what? In fact, we gave a talk yesterday, and a judge raised her hand. Ms. Scoon, that's not allowed. I said, I know. But it's written it's written there. So we have a lot of interesting things going on. What we're doing across the state is educating lawyers to try to give pro bono help so they can work with returning citizens. It's pretty confusing to figure out what people need to do or not do, and even finding records is difficult. So the litigation is going on. Where I want to go with all of this is I want to end by saying, giving you some things that I've seen that can be very, very successful. And again, I've looked at the attendees, and I've looked at many of the leaders that we're going to hear from, and I'm very excited to have conversations with you and hear the different keynotes, and I'm going to be taking a lot of my own notes about what people are saying. But let's look at the people that worked on Amendment 4. They were super, super, super passionate. Let's remember our suffragettes and how they started. It's okay to be passionate. It's okay to really care. I mean, go there. Find things that you really care about, and that could be the environment. It could be, some issue that just, you don't even think it's work when you're working on it. It's just like you're eating cotton candy because you care about it so much. Because that connection with the issue, just like the suffragettes found, that connection is liberating and enabling. It takes you into creative places. It makes you be able to bridge when people are different from you, because they feel that internal feeling that you have, and it's real. You say real things. And it forces you out of your silo, so you go out and you try to communicate with people. It makes the work easier, harder. It communicates authenticity. and creates a bridge of communication. When you go out there with your passion, I would ask you to consider another thing, which I tell people frequently, and I try to practice it myself. I'm struggling myself, but try when you're going into different communities, look and assess what are they doing already? What do they care about already? You know, is it a community center they need down there, or are they struggling because a principal they think is being mistreated, but their local school is being closed? It's really, really impactful to find out what's going on. And sometimes it's not political. Sometimes it's cultural. A lot of the African American churches, for example, is one example of things to do, starting a celebration in January through February, because you start with Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday. And the churches have many functions, fashion shows, discussions. The youth give speeches. They have award ceremonies. Grandma's cooking her favorite pie. Stuff is going on. It's organic and it's real. Then you flow that into Black History Month. There's a lot of opportunities to work on issues and things that people that you say you care about, work on what they care about. That shows goodwill, that builds bridges, it shows that you want to be part of the community, not a helicoptered in person who happens to look different, and then you leave because you don't really know what's going on in that community. That's something that I think can help with everybody. After you build the trust, then and over time, and you'll get that little ding in your heart and your mind when you realize that people are calling you for other stuff or just thinking that you're a part of their community because you've been there for a couple of years or a year. It takes time. You know, you've built that relationship. Then they might say, well, you know, it's time to vote. Should we do a forum? You know, they're going to invite you in. You're not going to have to be the person, well, how do I get these people to come? You know, we did all this work and nobody turned up. I've been there. I've done it. I've done it myself. And I've tried to walk backwards from being really passionate and know-it-all and I'm going to fix this problem. It's not how it works. And people are tired of it. The communities we're reaching out to are tired of the helicoptered people who are not really there. And guess what? They feel they are not being seen. And guess what? That is a version of what they experience when they go to the store. And they don't get good service. Or someone says, may I help you in a suspicious way? They're already dealing with that all day long. You don't need to add to the annoyance by falling into that, I don't really see you. You're just a means to an end. Give me your vote. I'm out of here. Because that's what some of myself included, some of the behavior that in our passion trying to get it done, we skip that personal connection. So just be aware that there's a buildup residue of feelings that way. I really think also because of the history that we have, certain groups are more prone to say my vote doesn't matter. Because historically, they weren't allowed to vote. And historically, in you know, just the generation that's just getting to the top in the 80s, many of those people lived through violent times where standing up and voting and doing things could have cost their life. And I go on and on with stories about that, and I've probably gone over my time. Are you nodding? Okay, I'm about there. So bottom line is those people are still out there. They've shared those stories with their families. And so when we do anything that makes voting unpleasant or being talked down to or disrespected, it kind of flows together with those violent history, and it makes it no fun. It's not for me. I don't want to get in that world. I'm important in my world. I'm going to stay in my church. I'm going to stay in my neighborhood because I'm important. I'm the coach of the little. They respect me when I come, coach. Not, oh, Mr. Who? Mr. You know, don't even remember who you are. Those kind of experiences. So I hope people got a little bit of nugget out of something that I said, and I'm wishing everybody their best journey, their most authentic journey, because when you look from within and you find what you care about, and you bring that to other people, and you start with them where they are, and empower them by doing what they said is important, I think you're on a good way to success. Thank you.